At this time, we'd like to invite Mr. Dr. Robin to come on.
Thank you, Bob. It's really a pleasure to be up here instead of down there. And before I go any further, I want you to know I see a lot of friendly faces out there. Thank you very much for coming. It means a lot to me. This is a special day for me. I looked at my calendar and I realized that today, 59 years ago, was the day I first performed on the Dick Clark Show. Today. Kind of interesting. And I was just barely 17 at the time. You have to pardon me a little bit. I've got some asthma and I've been taking an inhaler and it kind of makes me a little hoarse today. So I hope you'll excuse me, but I think I can still speak. Where do I begin? A lot of you have heard some stories at bars, lounges, homes, and other things, and I clearly have a lot of stories over those 59 years that are musically involved, and some academically, but that's not why we're here today. Today is special for me also because this may be the last time that I can honor a few people that meant a tremendous amount to me during my musical career. Clearly there were hundreds that were influential, and you just don't get where I got without, one, a tremendous amount of luck and a tremendous amount of mentorship and good old help. And so I just want everyone to know, you just don't get there by yourself. The first person I would like to honor, before I go farther, let me do a little sidebar here. First person I want to honor are my parents. Number one, they were fabulous parents. They only asked two things of me while they were alive. One, never embarrass us. But I think I messed that one up several times. And secondly, get a good education, because in those days, back in the 40s, you really didn't have to have an education to make it. But they could see the future, the writing on the wall, and realized that a good education was basically a calling card to so many opportunities. Well, clearly, as you can hear, I did stay in school, even throughout my entire career in music. And I've never really forgotten that, and I'm very, very pleased that I did stick with it, because I'll be honest, there were tremendous temptations to get out, you know, and go crazy in Hollywood, which I kind of did anyway for about 7 years. But I did go to school at Pepperdine, which was just down the street from Hollywood. When I did perform or do things, many times I'd be backstage. As most of you entertainers know, you have probably 10 or 15 glorious minutes on stage and days of boredom in the green room. And many times what we would do is, one, get to know all the other people who were stars. I mean, again, I was so lucky, I didn't realize that I was even on stage with these people. I looked up to people like the Everly Brothers or Buddy Holly or whatever, who literally were, I won't say my idols, but I had every record they ever put out. And there I was standing on stage with them. But regardless, whenever I was backstage, they'd ask for my autograph in an 8x10, and of course I would do the same. And I would send them to my mother, because I knew she was my #1 fan. And I knew that she would appreciate it. And so about 4 years before she died, she said, "Robin, I've got a big couple of boxes of stuff down in the basement, and if you're interested, I'd like you to have them." Well, I went down there, and literally everything that I had sent her, she had kept. And I'm going to pass these around. These are strictly 8x10s that were done backstage or some performances. And Ken, if you'll pass up maybe over this table and this one over there. Just take a look through them. They'll be available after my presentation. We moved to Honolulu, Hawaii in 1953. Before that time, we were in College Park, Georgia, and I was 5 years old when that Christmas of 1948, my mother bought me a ukulele and just gave it to me. And it was properly tuned. And she had also bought me just loads of those little yellow golden records. Do you remember those? And they had all the nursery rhymes and the Disney songs. And I had learned them all almost by heart because I also had a little teeny phonograph. And this is at 5. And I started singing and playing them. And then when my mother gave me the ukulele, somehow I learned chords and I started playing all the songs by myself. Well, my mother was quite a musician. She was a very good violinist and played the clarinet. So she thought immediately that I should have an instrument. And remember, this is 1948, and my dad worked for Douglas Aircraft as a service rep, which meant that every 2 years or 3, we would have to move and go to another airline that had bought Douglas planes. And he would be on site there to make sure those things stayed in the air. Well, because of that, my mother decided that a trumpet would be far too loud in hotels. A piano was literally out of the question. And so she thought to get a big ukulele. That's called a guitar. And at that time, in '48, if you think about it, the only people playing guitars were orchestral musicians who were educated on downstrokes with a plectrum or a pick, doing vamps in an orchestra for rhythm, and or cowboys, country and western it was called in those days. The first time we arrived in College Park, Georgia, we stayed at the Henry Grady Hotel, which was the hotel in Atlanta. And there was a young group that were singing at the dinner show every night. And the guy's name was Eddie Arnold and the Tennessee Plowboys. And they had their Cadillac out front with horns on it and a teardrop trailer where they put their instruments. Well, my parents would eat there every night, and so at 5 years old, I was watching Eddie Arnold and the Tennessee Plowboys. And I was mesmerized, so mesmerized that Eddie Arnold, started noticing me sitting there, and he would let me sit on the side of the stage when my parents, believe it or not, left. And I don't know what they did, but I have an idea. And I would sit there until he finished his set. And clearly that was an impetus to get a guitar, because Eddie always played the guitar. And he had a very nice blonde J200, by the way. So my mother immediately set out to find the best guitar player in Atlanta. And this name, Perry Bechtel, kept coming up. And so she did not have a car, so she got in on the bus, drove the 7.5 miles from our house to Atlanta, to the Atlanta Music Store, one store in Atlanta, on Peachtree Street. And she walked in, asked where Perry Bechtel was. He had a studio, and she walked back and introduced herself. And I have to understand, my mother was 4'9", maybe 4'10", when she was mad, and very, very Irish. She was born in Belfast, Ireland. And she walked up to Perry and said, "I would like you to teach my son how to play the guitar." Well, he was just taken aback, and he said, "Ma'am, I don't teach beginners. I certainly do not teach children." He said, "I have masters of guitar come to me for clinics of 1 week to 1 month duration." And she would have none of that. She said, "But he plays the ukulele, and he's really good at it." And she went on, and to make a long story short, he finally, just to get rid of her, I think, said, "Well, go home, have him practice, come back next week for an audition. Well, that's what she did. She made me practice every day. She went to Sears Roebuck at the time and bought me my first Glen plaid suit with a little red bow tie, a little red kerchief. And a week later, I was in front of Perry Bechtel. And I can remember, it's really emotional for me, because I can remember my mother standing like this, you know, just proud as she could be, and me standing there playing my ukulele. Supposedly, I played it for about 25 to 30 minutes till I ran out of songs. He turned to my mother and said, I will teach him how to play the guitar. But we went out to the music store, and it was just one of those beautiful old stores that's about 30 feet wide, 100 feet long. On one side are solid wooden glass cabinets with woodwinds and brass. On the other side was all stringed instruments. And when you walk in, you get that, guitar players, you know this, you get that incredible smell of aged tone woods. Well, he took us outside and said, Mrs. Luke, I will do it, but you'll have to have him buy a Gibson guitar. Well, she was kind of taken aback by the thought of a good guitar, but really didn't know what Gibson meant. He went to the Gibson group, which was about a 20-foot long section of guitars, and picked out the least expensive one that they had, which was an LG2. Right, Tom? LG2?
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, okay. But it did have carved braces, but it was a 3/4 size guitar. And he said, and there were about 4 of them, and he went down the row and said, this is the one, this is the one. And he asked the owner how much it was, and it was $80. $80, my mother said, I can't afford that. So he stood there for a minute and said, well, Saul, can she buy it on time for $2 a week? And he said, well, if you'll back her, we'll do it. And that's how I got my first guitar. And remember, this is a 3/4 size guitar. That's me in my Glen plaid suit with this 3/4 guitar that looks like, you know, a Super 400. Okay, very good. I took lessons from Perry for 5+ years, because in 53, 48, 49, 51, yeah, 5 years, we went to Hawaii. But there's a story here, and I would certainly like to honor Perry Bechtel. My mother and I had no idea who he was. We had no idea how famous he was. I mean, when he was in his 20s, he was Eddie Peabody's partner on the Orpheum circuit, and Eddie Peabody was, of course, very famous as a banjo player. Perry became the #1 plectrum, or 4-string banjo player in the U.S. This is one of his many albums. I have this one at home, Perry Bechtel Banjo, the greatest of them all. And you should hear it. It's amazing. But that wasn't really what made Perry a legend in the world of guitars. In 1993, Charles Martin, by the way, Perry was endorsed not only by Gibson, but by Martin Guitars. And this is for all you guitar freaks out there. In 1993, they came out with a special series of legends of guitar musicians. This book, put out by the Martin Company, has Martin guitar masterpieces, and they are some of the finest guitars ever made by Martin Company. In 1993, a Perry Bechtel commemorative OM-28 was conceived to play tribute to the man who is credited with the development of the 14-fret neck on Martin guitars. Bechtel was well known in the 20s and 30s of the plectrum banjo, but as popularity of the guitar increased, popularity of tenor and plectrum banjos waned across the U.S. It says here the OM28 became the first Martin limited edition to pay tribute to an artist. Unfortunately, he passed away 10 years before, but for him to be the very first that Martin ever honored is amazing. The next one is Gene Autry for the D45. That's, oh, you can tell me, but I know I've seen them sold for over $50,000. They're extremely pricey instruments. When I heard that they were honoring Perry, I immediately called Charles Martin IV and told him the story that I just told you. And he was surprised because nobody ever knew that he ever taught a kid how to play the guitar. And he was very, very stern but friendly, because he taught me really the orchestral method, which is picks, downstrokes. The first year I never played a song. I ran scales. I mean, you know, he was that kind of guy. And then after about a year, he started, you know, showing me chords, and he was a master at the guitar. And we would go to his club, which I can't remember if it was Lions or Elks or what. And I would play rhythm accompaniment, and he would do these marvelous runs, crescendos, and all of that. Did that for several years. But the bottom line is, here's a guy that was so famous. He went to Martin, and because he had a plectrum banjo, which runs a lot of scales, you know, and a lot of octaves, got it? That he decided that there should be an extended neck guitar so he could also, would be easier to get up an octave. And for several years, Martin screwed around trying to make one to please him, and eventually it did. And although it was made in 28, and they came out with the OM, actually it was triple O at the very beginning, but then they changed it to OM for orchestra model, because that was what he was. He was an orchestra musician, and 28 for 1928. And it became commercialized in 29. In 93, as I just showed you, they came out with a limited edition. I called Charles Martin, told him the story, and begged him to put me on the list. And he said, if you would have only called me 6 months ago. He said, we haven't made them yet, and they're all sold out. And I was heartbroken, you know. I know it was a major purchase, but at the same time, I was really kind of just, you know, really sad. Well, to make a good story better, about 5 years later, I was going through religiously my Virgin, not my Virgin, but my help me, Vintage Guitar magazine, and lo and behold, in Oregon, there was a dealer that had one for sale. Well, you know, I just ran to the phone, called, and said, what condition it is in. He said the guy bought it, put it under his bed, it hadn't been played. Well, there was no negotiation, and I bought the guitar, and there it is. So you're welcome to take a look at it. It is a beautiful guitar, very well made, and it works, okay? It was very hard to say goodbye to Perry, but he had taught me literally how to play the guitar. And I went to Hawaii, and for about 3.5 years, I would surf. I surfed every day for 5.5 years. And during that time, after I got out of the water, I would go up and play with the Beach Boys with my old 1948 LG2. And I'm not talking about the Beach Boys, I'm talking about real Beach Boys. And these guys, these beautiful Hawaiian singers. Have you ever heard Hawaiian harmonies? They are just magnificent, particularly the way they slide. You know, they always do these wonderful slides in 3-part harmony. And I really got into that, and before I knew it, about the 3rd year I was there, or 4th year, because I was there 7th grade through high school, I wrote a song. And I tried to figure out whose name to put to it, and I decided to put Susie on there because that was my sister. And in 1958, when the song came out, she was 5.5 years old, just like I was when I first started playing instruments. And that kept me out of trouble with all the gals in high school, putting her name to it. And I sang that song at a variety show with my best friend. In Hawaii, we have something at my school, Punahou, called the Punahou Variety Show, and the Punahou Carnival. And it is a big deal still on the island. I mean, they bring from the mainland Ferris wheels and loop-de-loops and whips, and it's a big deal of the year. And it makes a lot of money for our school. But every year they have a variety show with school talent. In those days, it was 50 cents to get in. And my dear friend, my best friend, Dick Edney, played the gut bucket. Everybody know what that is? Big round 55-gallon drum with a big cord and a broom. Oh my God. Yeah. And he stood next to me while I sang Susie Darling. Immediately after the show, a guy came down the aisle backstage and asked if I wanted to make a record. Well, sure, I'm 16. I said, sure, sounds great. And you can see how this is going. I mean, I never aspired to be a singer or any of that, but it just happened. So he said, okay, let's do it. Now, he had a very small label called Bertram International, and he made hula records for the tourists. They come, oh, sweet little lady. And we recorded the song in Hawaii in an apartment next to a hospital on a portable Ampex thin tape recorder, but it had sound on sound, something new, where you could lay down a track, listen to it on the headphones, and sing over it. But if you made a mistake, you had to start all over, because it wasn't a separate track, it was sound on sound. Needless to say, it took about 3 months to record it. There were 7 overdubs, and I did about 5 of them. The clickety click click, click 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 click, click click. That is a Schaefer pen in my pocket, hitting it with 2 sticks. The drums were it's a Capitol Records cardboard box with real brushes. And the echo chamber was the bathroom. He had a speaker at one end and a mic at the other. And when I came to, oh, he would flip a switch and it would zoom into the bathroom. And they go, oh, Susie Darling, then he'd have to turn it off. The other problem was we were right next to a hospital, and there were many times when we were working on the 6th track where all of a sudden we'd hear an ambulance would take off and we have to start all over. It was really quite a frustrating experience, but we got it done. And by the way, that is the first rock and roll song that had a ukulele in it. Okay? I did play ukulele in there as well. If you really listen, you can hear it. But you can only imagine, after 7 overdubs, it was extremely muddy. Don't forget what we were working with, a portable Ampex. And what's curious about that is, and I'm going to jump way ahead, when Randy Wood, the president of DOT, bought the master from Bertram, he immediately said we have to go to United Recording Studios on Sunset Boulevard to re-record it. I was all for that, but it was gorgeous. We had the Jack Halloran singers, about 10-piece orchestra, and away we went. And it was absolutely gorgeous. It was beautiful. But it didn't have that sound. It just didn't have that driving dun 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 dun. And he couldn't use it because it was non-union. So we did the union session, and then he switched them. So the old bedroom version was the one that you all heard, if you heard it at all. And jumping back a moment, it was #1 in Hawaii for 6 months. And a honeymooning couple from Dot Records heard it, took it to Randy Wood. He liked it, he bought the master. Boom, that was it. My dad went with me the very first time. And as you may notice in one of those light blue books, the first photo is me and my dad leaving to go to the Dick Clark Show today, 59 years ago. And it was interesting because in those days, we didn't have instant gratification. We didn't have satellites. We first went to Philly, and then Baltimore, and then Washington. And everywhere we went, the next week was #1. They just popcorned everywhere we went. So, you know, I get back to Hawaii, Randy calls me up again and says, "You're on the Saturday Night Dick Clark Show. Get back here." The first year in '58, I was in school about 3 weeks out of the whole year. Because every time I got back home, I'd get called to go somewhere else. And I'm sure it was expensive for somebody, but fortunately not me. And that first year and a half, I was well over 100,000 miles. I'm trying not to tell stories because there are so many that I could really bore you over time, and we don't have time. Only got 20 more minutes. But the reality is that I decided to stay in school. And what that did for me was keep me from doing a lot of touring, of which I'm not necessarily disappointed. But I would go to college all week long at Pepperdine, and got a degree in biology and chemistry and psychology. And after that, in 1964, I decided I really loved to learn and I loved going to college. Never realizing that I ended up spending my life in it. But I was accepted at MU for a program, and I went, ultimately getting my MBA and PhD there. But to go back for a moment, yes, there was 7 years that I basically was involved in the music business, and 31 songs. I've got to tell you one story. I was at Gold Star Studio cutting a record, and my studio band for about 2 years were the Champs. You may remember Tequila. It was a pretty big song for them. But they were really good musicians. And one day, we were doing the session, and Dave Burgess, the leader of the Champs, comes around, and I was in this cubicle with my guitar, trying to isolate myself from the rest of the group. And he said, "We got a new kid in town. His name is Glenn Campbell, and he's going to try to play with us on the road, on one of the road crews. You know, what did they call? Traveling bands. You remember the song Traveling Band, I think, don't you? Yeah. Pretty Polynesian baby. Okay, anyway. The Champs had 3 bands, because in those days, we didn't have satellite, remember? And so they could have the real Champs on the West Coast, another band in the Midwest, and then one on the East Coast, because nobody knew who they were. And Glenn Campbell was trying out for one of the traveling bands. So I said, yeah, you know, he's as good as you say he is, and let's go. So he sat, about 8 feet in front of me, and Milt Rogers, the A&R man and arranger, actually, came in and he starts passing out all sheet music for the session. And Glenn grabs hold of it, and he's looking at it. He's flipping it over, looking at it. Well, I walked around, I'd forgotten his name, but I went over by his ear and I said, "You can't read music, can you?" And he looked up and said, "No, Mr. Luke, I'm sorry, I can't." And I said, "Well, if you're as good as Dave says you are, I'll have them play the demos a couple of times before we record, and you just fake it." And he did, and it was fabulous. It was terrific. I got to know him very, very well. In fact, years and years later, Perry Leslie was the head of Highland Springs out here. He was the director of golf. And they had a big celebrity round. And Glenn was one of the stars. Darryl LaMonica used to play quarterback for the Oakland Raiders. Smothers Brothers and a guy named Willie Nelson was there. And Perry asked me if I'd be Glenn's caddy. And I said, "You were good friends." He said, "Sure, love to be his caddy." So we're going down the first fairway, and there were about 200 people or so walking with us. Perry had a big megaphone, and he, in his wonderful Louisiana tinged accent, he goes, well, Glenn, I understand you and Robin go back a long time. And he said, yep, Robin Luke gave me my first paycheck in Hollywood. And look at him now, he's carrying my bags. I have to tell that story. Well,
Is that you making noise?
the Perry Como show was very exciting for me because at that time it was the #1 show on TV. And for whatever reason, Perry took a real liking to me because he said I reminded him a lot of his son, Ronnie. And I just had a wonderful time doing that. But I think the best part was that at that time, again, no digital, no satellites. So we literally rehearsed for 5 days. Got there on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and rehearsed very quick ones. Just basically standing on the X and walking through it, you know, with your shorts on and a t-shirt. And then on Saturday, they had a legitimate dress rehearsal with a full audience. And so that was a no-stop deal unless somebody really boo-booed. Well, we got through that, and they just pushed the people out and bring a whole crowd in for the real show. And it went very well. The record just took off again. And what was amazing about Susie Darling, and why, you know, again, to attribute its success was its longevity. It was on the charts for over a year. And it came up very slowly because it was regional. And then all of a sudden, Perry Como show, boom, goes up 10 or 15 and what have you, and finally got to the West Coast. And so it stayed on a long time, got to the top 5 in the nation. And someone just asked me a short time ago before the presentation, were you Rockin' Robin? And the answer is I did a lot of shows with Bobby Day of Rockin' Robin fame. He wrote it. His real name was Robert Byrd, and I got to know him so very well. In fact, we went to Australia together with Johnny Cash. There's a program right down here about that for 2.5 weeks. So I really got to know him then. And his song never got as high as mine did. And in the old days, the song that sold the most or was #1, you would go on last. And the one that was next to the highest would go on next to last. Well, he was always just below me. And as a result, his finishing song was Rockin' Robin. And so he would sing Rockin' Robin, get off the stage, and the MC would always say, and here he is, Rockin' Robin Luke. And as a result, a lot of people thought I either sang it or wrote it or whatever. The answer is I did none of that. But I have sung it quite a few times. It's a great song. And I think they play that on the oldies more than they play Susie Darling. And for good reason. But, well, you know, there's so much to say. And I've said a lot already. Again, the other person I want to honor today, and it's in those books, is a man named Tom Moffat. He died 2 years ago. When we first met, we were both very young. I was 17 and he was 21. He was, everybody in every town had a #1 disc jockey, right? He was the #1 disc jockey at K-Poi Radio. Poi, you know, the food. K-Poi Radio. And he became the MC for the Show of Stars, which was an enormous rock and roll show every month in Hawaii. And that went on for years. They would bring the very best talent of the previous month to Hawaii. Orientals, Asians now. I love the word Oriental. Can't understand why we call them Asians. But enough said. Asians love rock and roll music. I mean, they love it. And we would have 2 shows on Friday, 3 shows on Saturday, 3 shows on Sunday in the old boxing arena called the Civic Auditorium. one of the joys of that was not only that Tom and I became best buddies riding around in his 55 Ford Skyliner. Remember, that's one that the top would come in the trunk? Right. And he was a handsome guy. In fact, you can see it in some of the pictures. And we just go all over town. And we were good for each other. I know he used me, and I know I used him. But when Susie Darling was going up the charts, and I told you it was #1 in Hawaii, for 6 months, he played that thing every 25 minutes for 6 months. I mean, I owe him an incredible debt of gratitude. And he also did extremely well. You know, very quickly, he became a promoter in Hawaii. You may remember, well, he just brought over the very best talent ever. You may remember the Elvis in Hawaii tour. Some of you have seen it on tapes and that. He brought that over. He brought over Michael Jackson, the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, you know, and as a result, he became a very wealthy man. But I will never forget him. I guess maybe the last person I want to say thank you and honor to is my wife, Mary. 16 years, almost. 15 and a half years. And she has kept me vertical. She's an RN. And if I get any more chicken at home, I'm going to start pecking in the sand. But for reasons unbeknownst to me, she wants to keep me alive. And I thank God and Mary for that. Okay, I think I'm through. Are there any questions?
You and Buddy Holly.
Okay, I actually have a book down here that probably would be better if I read it to you. I did a lot of shows with him, but stand up. A guy called me a few years ago and said, "Robin, there is a definitive book on Buddy Holly out." And I said, "Cool, I want to buy it." And he goes, "No, you're in it." And that really surprised me. And it goes like this. In late '58, while Perry was in Clovis plotting their downfall, I don't even know who, oh, Petty, Norman Petty, not Perry, but Norman Petty, who did all his recording in Clovis. And by the way, the echo chamber in Clovis, New Mexico, was a standard oil truck. Microphone at one end, yeah, speaker at the other. So we weren't far off. I learned that from Buddy years, about 6 months later. Well, okay, the Crickets continued their East Coast swing, making 2 appearances on national TV in October. On the first, the Dick Clark Saturday Night Show, Buddy sang "It's So Easy." The telecast was taped in Manhattan's Little Theater at Times Square on October 25th with an all-star lineup, including Buddy, Frankie Avalon, Don Gibson, oh, one for me, Bobby Day, and Robin Luke. Buddy was getting along better with the new friends he met in New York, especially Robin Luke, than he was with his fellow Texans, which helps explain why he was being drawn more and more to the city. Not long after that, he dumped the Crickets and became just Buddy Holly. Luke, a young Los Angeles-born singer who'd scored a million-seller on Dot with Susie Darling, he treasured his brief, intense encounter with Buddy on the Dick Clark Show. They spent hours together in Buddy's dressing room, where Buddy gave Luke a marathon, hour-and-a-half guitar lesson, demonstrating how he blocked the strings with his right hand to get the muted guitar sound on Peggy Sue. It goes on. But that was true, and I don't know how this guy got there. You know, I swear he must have had his ear to the door. But the reality is that we comped each other. I showed him my rhythm things on Susie Darling. He showed me all kinds of stuff. And when I sing Peggy Sue, I play it like Buddy played it. Okay, because frankly, it's pretty easy. Is that a good Buddy Holly answer? Okay.
There you go.
Well,
Tom?
you've told me so many wonderful stories in the past, and I did want to hear the one about Allentown, Pennsylvania again.
Oh,
But
brother.
I also wanted you to bring up Richie Valens sleeping backstage.
Yeah, okay. Okay, Allentown, Pennsylvania. On my very first trip, the first one that my dad joined me. We did a lot of visits to DJs. Number one, you had to do it in those days, or they wouldn't play your record. And they loved to have you interview. Nowadays, you can't get on a radio to do an interview. But in those days, DJs really appreciated it. So we did go, like I told you, we go to Baltimore, Washington, and we went up to Allentown, Pennsylvania. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but in the 50s, Allentown was a blue collar town. It was the center of coal and rough. And here I am, barely 17, and I'm listening to the DJ before we get there. It's on the radio. And he was the #1 DJ in Allentown. And he's going something like this. Well, y'all, it's really good now. We're going to have Robin Luke here. Robin Luke going to come on in here and play some rock and roll. Yes, sir. Wow, it's going to be great. And I'm going, wow, okay, good. So anyway, we go into the studio, and I get next to this guy that's talking on the mic, and he's going, well, it looks like Robin Luke done be here now. He's coming on in. We're going to listen to him, okay? Well, here he is, Robin Luke. You from Hawaii, right? And I said, yes, I am. And you live in a grass shack? I said, no, I don't. My parents have a home. And he said, well, what kind of Hawaiian food do you eat? I said, well, hamburgers, hot dogs, and occasionally, a kaluapua. And he goes, kaluapua? What is it? Well, I'm noticing this guy. And he says, he comes out and he says, is you a Hawaiian? And I said, why no, I'm just as white as you are. He looks at me, he just slams all the dials, rolls them off, and goes, God damn it, I'm gonna get this son of a out of here. I'm gonna kill him. Well, to make a long story short, he was known as the Phantom. Nobody could ever identify him because through his voice to be a black DJ. And he was white as I was. And he could walk out of the studio and get in his Cadillac. Nobody ever knew who the heck he was. True story, Tom. I hope I made that as clean as I did. Okay? There are stories like that literally I've forgotten it, Tom, until you brought it up.
Carl Perkins.
Okay, you also asked about
Richie Valens sleeping backstage.
in November of 1958, we had a show of stars. And Richie Valens really hit it. He'd come out with Donna, and Come On, Let's Go, and that other one. I can't think. Thank you, that other one. Yeah, the big one. Yeah, and we were all rehearsing, everything was great, and I was leaving, and as I left, I looked over in the green room, and he's unrolling a bedroll. It looked like a bedroll. I went in there and I said, what are you doing? They put everybody up at the Hawaiian Village. And with a look that showed me a lot more maturity than I had at the time. He said, Robin, he said, my parents are extremely poor. And I talked to the management, and they would give me $40 more a day if I slept in the green room. Because I want to take all this money back to my parents, and I don't know how much longer I'll be doing this. He died 3 months later. Terrible story. But it's a good one.
Yes.
It's a good one.
Thank you.
Yeah, Chris.
Isn't there a story you said about in Hawaii where it was Johnny Cash and Perkins and all of them, and wasn't it you were in rooms or something like that, and Cash was pretty drunk or out of it? I remember you telling me a story about.
When you spend 2.5 weeks with Johnny, you get to know him really well.
Yeah.
And as you can see by his picture on the program, he was very young in those days. I think he was like 28. We spent a lot of time together because he was painfully shy, and so was I. So we hit it off. And I'm not sure exactly what, I think I know what you're talking about. We were in Australia, we did shows in Sydney and Melbourne, and then Tasmania in August. Folks, that is the dead of winter down in Tasmania, which isn't too far from glaciers in Antarctica. And we were performing in front of about 3,000 people in this enormous wooden barn, literally. And you could see snowflakes come through some of the cracks. It was so cold, it was hard to keep the guitars in tune. And Johnny came on last. I was next to last. Even though my song was #1 at the time in Australia. I mean, he was enormous. And you know, just come out, but I walked the line. And, you know, my gosh, I thought he was great. And he was. But he was so shy. And we come up with a routine where since he was last, I would get out his guitar case. When he came off stage, I'd grab his guitar, throw it in the guitar case, snap it up. I had mine ready, and we'd take off. Well, I'd come off stage, done my thing, and the MC went, "And now, ladies and gentlemen, the one you've all been waiting for." And he's standing there, and I came up about here on him, you know. Because, I mean, at that time, he had like a 30-inch waist and 52-inch chest. I mean, he was a giant of a man. And he had those, well, I'll call them cheesy it was 1960. And they had those cowboys kind of suits. What do you call that material? Polyester. Remember those? They had the little thing, little V in the front and all that. Well, he had one of those, and his shoulders were so wide that his suit just came down. And then it would go in about a foot on each side to his rear end. You know, it's really interesting. Well, anyway, he said, "Now, ladies and gentlemen, here he is, the one and only." He reached in his left breast pocket and would pull out a fifth of Gilby's gin. And he would just go, he'd pull about a third of the bottle because that's what gave him the courage to get on stage. And if any of you wonder how he got that voice, I think it was Gilby that was creative. Well, to finish this one story, the very last show in Tasmania, he finishes, he's through, he runs off stage, I'm get his guitar, go to put it down, and I hear this sound that no entertainer in the 50s liked to hear. And I imagine there was a few since that time. But the crowd had gone nuts, broken through the police line, and has jumped on the stage, and they're coming after us. Ooh. Now, folks, that is frightening, okay? I mean, I have literally had my clothes ripped off me, okay, by young ladies who would never think of doing it in a group of 3. But you put 500 together, and I'm telling you, it's a game. It's a sport. But in this occasion, they're running after us. Gene Vincent was on the tour also, one of the great guys. And he was in the twilight of his career, and he had a motorcycle accident on his Harley and had a full hip cast from his ankle all the way up to here, and then a little bit of a thing here, and then up around his waist. And it was all a hard cast. And he had borrowed Bonnie Guitar's White Falcon guitar. Had Bonnie Guitar engraved on it. And at the time, that was one of the more expensive guitars. Well, he had borrowed it because he didn't have any dough. And he has his guitar, I have my guitar. Now Johnny's got his. We start running down this long ramp to the limo. And man, those people are behind us about 10 seconds. We can hear them just coming. And at that moment, Gene Vincent tripped on his cast, you know, because he's running, click, click, and click, and click, like this. And he tripped, and the guitar goes flying in the case. Boom, boom, boom. Well, we immediately ran back. Johnny got under one arm, I got under the other. We're dragging him. And we get the other guitar, and we get to the limo, and away we go. We get back to our hotel. We had the entire top floor to ourselves, about 10 rooms, but because of that, we had a guard at the top, at the stairs, and what do we do? We're guys. We get there at 1:30 in the morning. We just take all our clothes off except for our shorts and a t-shirt. And we're in our rooms, and all of a sudden we hear, Johnny and I run to Gene's bedroom. He's standing looking at the guitar case on the bed, and the biggest piece was the size of this book. It had exploded, as Gretches are wont to do. They're extremely light and somewhat poorly made. Sound great, terribly made. Okay. You know, that is the last I ever saw of Gene Vincent. He finished the tour, and that was it. And he died about 10 years later, I'm told. Okay, anything else? We're 5 minutes over. Mike?
You were getting ready to perform the concert, and the Everly Brothers were there, and you all were backstage, and you were talking with their manager about who's going to open. Do you remember that story?
No, I don't. I must have made that one up. No, I really don't. I remember a lot of stories with the Everlys. I had a lot of shows with them. But my favorite is when I was new to the game. Tom Moffat, the MC/DJ, and I greeted every act that came off a propeller airplane in Hawaii. We would stand at the bottom of the stairs. And the Everly Brothers were coming, and they had just come up with Wake Little Susie, Dream, you know, 2 monster hits. And they were clearly going to be #1, right? They thought. So they come off the plane, and Don had his wife Shirley, who he later divorced, and of course Phil is there, a real cut-up. So we get to the bottom, throw a layover, their nags, welcome to Hawaii, blah, blah, blah. Don's all business. Don says, my gosh, it's 3 o'clock, we got a 7 o'clock show, we got to get to the place, I want to do a sound check, we got to make sure everything's good, blah, 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 because when we go on last, I want to make sure. And Tom interrupted him and said, Don, you aren't going on last. And he said, Robin Luke has the #1 song here. He's going on last. And he looked at Tom and said, Robin Luke? Who the hell is Robin Luke? And I went, I'm Robin Luke. True story. We laughed about that for 15 years. And he was real good to me when they came through. And they did that big show down in Branson years ago. They got me backstage. And I had one of the thrills of a lifetime meeting Albert Lee for the first time. One of the greatest guitar players of all time. Yeah.
In your book, you have a suite from Connie Francis thanking you for Stupid Cupid.
Oh, yeah. Connie Francis was probably one of the best vocalists I've ever heard on stage. I mean, she was magnificent, and you know that. But she had come out with a hit in the U.S. called Stupid Cupid. You remember that? Stupid Cupid, I'm a ring guy. Okay. Well, I heard it in L.A. because I was living there, going to school, but I had to go back for a show the next week in Hawaii. So I liked it so much, I learned it, took it back to Hawaii, and sang Stupid Cupid. And she came over a month later. She started to sing it, and they booed her. I had to run on stage and say, hey, this is her song, you know. And that's a true story. Never recorded it, but they actually booed her. It was terrible. But I got through it. Okay, I think one more question, and that'll do it. Bob?
I heard a story, but maybe some of the rest of you folks haven't. Remember when you got your first $50,000 royalty check?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, but what was the first thing you did with it?
You always remember the money, don't you, Bob? Well, the reality is, the first check, they weren't all like that, but the first check was $50,000, which was a lot in '58, let me tell you. So I went out and bought my mother a Lincoln Continental and a mink coat. That's what I did. Thank you so very much. I'll stick around if you have any questions.